"This isn't my line," the doctor finally said after pondering a long while, with his fascinated eyes on the snake. "Better give the psychiatrist a chance with you, I think. Go and see—" and he named a great man. "Wait a moment!" He telephoned the head of the hospital, and having first convinced him that he had not gone mad himself, persuaded him to phone the great man and lay the case before him. Within 10 minutes, Sims was assured the great man was deeply interested and would see Sims at 10:30. There was something being a unique case, Sims decided, on his way uptown. The Sunday sections of the newspapers, which he read religiously, had long been full of this Dr. Eisenmark, with particular emphasis on his uncompromising feuds with brother psychiatrists. Under ordinary circumstances, Sims could have become acquainted with international celebrities only through the papers, and yet here he was on his way to a personal interview with the greatest man he would probably ever meet in his life, with an entree assured, his passport coiled in a hat box under his arm. He treated himself to the luxury of a cab the whole way. 2 women, plump and well-dressed, got off at the same floor in the hotel and went ahead of him into Dr. Eisenmark's office. Sims marched intrepidly forward, said, "Mr. Sims, Polyphonic Hospital, 10:30. Door after door opened before him until he was in the great man's presence. Dr. Eisenmark was ugly. His arms hung ape-like from his stooped shoulders and swayed loosely as he paced the floor and inspected his subject. For a moment his gaze rested malevolently on the hat box, and Sims felt a passing pity for the dead snake. He looked square into Sims's face, and Sims's cheeks and jaws were suffused with the insipid sweat of embarrassment. But when he spoke, his voice was completely reassuring, in spite of a thick German accent, all the more so because it came on the heels of so much silent intimidation. His opening remarks were a strange combination of rudeness and brusque courtesy. He suspected Sims and his snake of being an elaborate hoax, and said so. On the other hand, he pointed out, there was often much interest to be found in the psychopathic aspects of elaborate hoaxes. He regarded Sims's keeping the appointment as primary evidence of good faith, and was glad to see him, and, if Mr. Sims did not mind, they would proceed at once to business. The first thing would be Mr. Sims's story, told without reservations, and as directly as possible. During his narrative, Sims astonished himself with his own pithy eloquence. He told it 3 times, as well as he had at the hospital, and ended with a touch of genuine drama, producing the incomprehensible evidence with proud and confident solicitude. There was a gleam of affection in his eye as he displayed the snake, for it was all that stood between him and being accused of bad faith or lunacy. Dr. Eisenmark nodded an accompaniment to the story, at first perfunctory, then vigorous, and finally, with narrowed eyes and bared teeth, he began to furnish exclamation points to the narrative, with hissing repetitions of "colossal." If Sims had been an actor, he would have been tempted to take a bow. "You will take another bath here, now," he said. "I shall go with you and see." He flung open a door and stood aside for Sims to pass through, observing him so narrowly all the while that Sims already felt naked. He barely needed to reassure the seeing of his faithful snake sprawled in the middle of the carpet, a pathetic thread of substance between him and the truth. "You take your bath warm?" asked Dr. Eisenmark, turning on the faucets with his hairy hands. "Undress!" As Sims took off his coat and vest, the psychiatrist sat himself on a corner of the wash basin and lighted a cigarette. "You see," he said, "I do not promise to think you a liar if there are no snakes now, but if there should be snakes now, what trouble would we save?" "Not snakes," said Sims, "only one." His hands were trembling as he slipped his undershirt over his head, and he was shaking from head to foot as he stepped into the warm water. "Come," said the psychiatrist, "I have seen ladies by the dozen giving birth to babies with more calm." Sims sat shivering in the water with his hands round his knees. The psychiatrist came and peered into the tub. "So," he said, "where is the snake?" "They don't come till I lie down," Sims mumbled. "Lie down!" said the psychiatrist. Sims lay down, and then leaped from the tub with a scream, almost knocking the great man down. When he recovered his composure, he was dripping in a corner, watching Dr. Eisenmark's effort to lay hands on a 4-foot green snake which was lashing the surface of the water with vigorous efforts to escape. "Wunderschönen," he was hissing to himself. "Ach, mein Schatz, mein Liebling, du lebst!" There was a final struggle, and the psychiatrist rose out of the tub, soaked to the waist, but clutching his prey in his hands. One fist held it firmly just below the head, so that its fangs were useless. His exultant eye spied a wicker hamper for dirty towels. In a panic of panting triumph, he popped the snake within and secured the rattan hasp. Then he came to Sims, threw his ape's arms around him, and kissed him soundly. "I am famous now," he said brokenly, "but I shall be more famous, and you will be famous with me. You must talk. I must ask you crazy questions. You must tell me so many things. Come." "But your other patients?" Sims asked, overcome by diffidence. "It is good for them to wait," said the psychiatrist, throwing him a towel. "It stimulates their egos. Schnell!" It was late afternoon, and the street lamps were lighted when Sims left Dr. Eisenmark and decided he had better walk home, even though his knees were still trembling beneath him. He felt as if someone had applied a stomach pump at the base of his brain. His taste in moving pictures and light function, his feelings toward his landlord, and his opinions on the heavyweight situation had all passed in review. He had told of things he had not thought of for years, particularly in connection with snakes. He had remembered the most accountable details of past trivialities. He suspected that he had remembered a great deal which had never happened, but the psychiatrist seemed to entertain no doubts. "What do you think?" he asked at the end, while Eisenmark stood in the gathering gloom, clasping and unclasping his hands. "I think so much," the great man said soberly. "But it is not for you to think or know of thoughts. I must do much also. You come back tomorrow at 2 o'clock and do not bathe. I shall bathe you here." Safely at home, Sims phoned his office to tell them he was sick and indefinitely in a doctor's hands. It was not entirely a lie, of course. He found himself pondering with unaccustomed subtlety on the real meaning of the word sick. If convenient abnormalities all came under the head, he could lay claim to being sick with a vengeance. Anyway, he had every right to a bit of private illness, on any pretext. What good was a record of 10 years' faithful service if you couldn't lay off now and again? He spent the evening in the public library reading about snakes, not only anacondas and boa constrictors and cobras, for his was not a romantic curiosity, but also about garter snakes and black snakes, beneficent vermin, which have been known to be companionable. From the moment he had seen the last arrival struggling in the doctor's grip, he had lost much of his loathing for the snake family. The man was so triumphant, and the reptile so harassed, and the next morning, when he saw the scar left by the bullet on the bottom of the bathtub, he was a trifle ashamed of himself for having attacked his guest in such an unsportsmanlike way. After all, it might have been more his doing than the snake's that it had been there. Such, at least, was the implication of some of the psychiatrist's questions. It is not strange, then, that he spent his morning in the snake house of the zoo. Here were many of the genera and species he had been reading about, heavily coiled in long glass cages, or restlessly exercising themselves in flickering rhythms. Even so, he was disappointed. These had nothing of the irreconcilable vigor of his own snakes. They were caged and did not seem to mind very much. Only one large boa, digesting evilly, with unblinking eyes, obscenely conscious of the lump back of his head, which represented a rabbit swallowed whole, appealed to Sims's new sensibility. He felt sure that this 15-foot gorged of malevolence could be irritable and thrash round in his cage. At 2 o'clock, Dr. Eisenmark welcomed Sims with a jubilant warmth which made him stare He also felt inclined to stare at the doctor's companion, a sharp-faced man who was introduced as Dr. Harvey, curator of reptiles, in the very zoo which Sims had been visiting. Scalpels and forceps were spread over the desk. "You see," said Dr. Eisenmark, "I have been forced to seek consultation. I know nothing of snakes, but my good friend here, who has spent the morning with me, he knows them like his 10 fingers. We have been violent with our friend of yesterday." And he produced a huge corkboard on which, pegged down, flayed and opened up,